I never imagined my life would come down to a single chilling moment on the open sea, a moment that would shatter everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and trust. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and crimson as our family yacht drifted lazily along the coast. Laughter echoed from the deck. Glasses clinked, and for a fleeting second, allowed myself to believe that happiness was finally within reach. Up. But beneath the surface, something far darker was brewing. It happened so quickly, barely had time to register the betrayal. One minute, my daughter-in-law, Julia, was smiling at me. Her arm looped through mine as we admired the horizon. The next, I felt a sharp shove so sudden, so forceful, it stole the breath from my lungs. I tumbled over the rail, the world spinning, the cold slap of the ocean swallowing my scream. As I fought to keep my head above water, I caught a glimpse of Julia's face peering down at me, her expression, not of shock or concern, but of cold calculation. In that instant, I understood. This was no accident. Julia wanted me gone. And, with me out of the picture, she stood to inherit everything's $3 billion. The legacy I'd spent a lifetime building. But what Julia didn't know was that I'm not so easy to erase. As the yacht sailed away, leaving me for dead, I made a silent promise. If I survived, I would make sure she and everyone else would never forget what she'd done. And when they finally returned home, thinking their secret was safe, they had no idea who would be waiting for them, or what I'd bring with me. From the outside, we looked like the kind of family people envied. Our home was a sprawling estate nestled in the hills with manicured gardens and a view that stretched for miles. My late husband, Richard, had built our fortune from the ground up, and after his passing, I became the steward of his legacy, responsibility I took seriously, not just for myself, but for our only son, Daniel. I poured my heart into raising him, determined to give him the stability and love I never had growing up. Daniel was my pride, my joy, and for years, I believed our bond was unbreakable. When Daniel brought Julia home for the first time, I wanted to welcome her with open arms. She was beautiful, poised, and seemed genuinely devoted to my son. Their whirlwind romance swept through our lives like a fresh breeze, and I tried to ignore the small voice inside me that whispered caution. Julia was everything Daniel had ever wanted, at least. That's what he told me. She was attentive, always eager to help, and quick to charm everyone she met. Our friends would often comment on how lucky I was to have such a close-knit family, and I would smile, playing my part in the perfect picture. But behind closed doors, the cracks began to show. Julia's warmth sometimes felt rehearsed, her compliments a little too polished. She had a way of steering conversations, subtly shifting the spotlight onto herself or Daniel, and away from anything that made her uncomfortable. I noticed how she bristled when I mentioned family traditions or brought up Richard's memory. At first, I chalked it up to nerves. After all, joining a new family can be daunting. But as time went on, the unease grew harder to ignore. Daniel, for his part, seemed blissfully unaware. He was smitten, eager to please, and often brushed off my concerns with a laugh. "Mom, you worry too much," he'd say, wrapping an arm around Julia's shoulders. "She's just trying to fit in." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that my instincts were wrong, that Julia's occasional coldness was just a misunderstanding. But there were moments, fleeting but unmistakable, when I caught a different side of her. A flash of irritation when she thought no one was looking. A tightness in her smile when Daniel wasn't around. The tension simmered beneath the surface, invisible to outsiders, but ever present in our home. I tried to bridge the gap, inviting Julia to join me in family rituals, sharing stories about Richard, hoping to build a connection. Sometimes she played along, but more often she seemed distracted, her eyes flicking to her phone or the clock. I began to notice how she took a keen interest in our finances, asking pointed questions about trusts, investments, and the future of the family business. I told myself it was natural for her to be curious, but the questions felt loaded, as if she was cataloging every detail. Still, I clung to the image of our perfect family, desperate to keep the peace for Daniel's sake. I ignored the warning signs, convinced that love and patience would win Julia over. But deep down, I knew something was off. The sense of unease grew with each passing day, a shadow lurking at the edges of our carefully curated life. I just never imagined how far that shadow would mature, how much it would cost us all. And as I look back now, I realize the signs were always there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment everything would unravel. It started with little things so small. At first, I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. Julia would forget to invite me to family dinners she planned with Daniel, or she'd change the time at the last minute, leaving me scrambling to catch up. When I'd arrive, breathless and apologetic, she'd flash that perfect smile and say, "Oh, I must have texted the wrong number. I'm so sorry, Mom." Daniel would laugh it off, but I saw the flicker of annoyance in Julia's eyes, as if my presence was an inconvenience she had to tolerate. One afternoon, I overheard Julia on the phone in the garden. Her voice was low, urgent, and she didn't notice me as I rounded the corner. "No, she hasn't signed anything yet," she whispered, "but I'll handle it. Trust me, it's just a matter of time." The words sent a chill through me, but when I stepped into view, she snapped her phone shut and greeted me with a bright, practiced warmth. "Just confirming a spa appointment for us, Margaret. I thought we could use some pampering." I forced a smile, but the unease gnawed at me. The manipulations grew bolder. Julia began suggesting changes to the family trust, always under the guise of protecting Daniel's future. She'd bring up stories of friends who'd lost everything due to poor planning, her tone dripping with concern. "You know, Margaret, it might be wise to update the documents, just in case. We wouldn't want anything to happen to the estate." Daniel, ever trusting, nodded along, eager to please his wife. I tried to push back gently, but Julia always had a counter-argument, always so reasonable, so logical, that I found myself second-guessing my own instincts. Then there were the moments when Julia's mask slipped. One evening, after a tense dinner, I found her in the study, rifling through my desk drawers. She jumped when I entered, her face flushing with irritation before she smoothed it over with a laugh. "I was just looking for a pen," she said, but her eyes darted away from mine. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation. But Daniel walked in, oblivious, and the moment passed. The emotional stakes rose with every incident. I felt myself withdrawing, questioning my own judgment, wondering if I was being paranoid. Julia seemed to sense my uncertainty and used it to her advantage, painting herself as the dutiful daughter-in-law to everyone else while subtly undermining me at home. She'd make offhand comments about my forgetfulness or old-fashioned ways in front of Daniel, planting seeds of doubt. "Maybe it's time to let us handle things, Mom. You've done so much already," she'd say. Her tone sweet, but her eyes cold. I tried to confide in Daniel, but he brushed off my concerns, insisting Julia only wanted what was best for the family. "She loves you, Mom. She just wants to help." I wanted to believe him, but the distance between us grew, a silent wedge driven deeper by Julia's careful manipulations. The final straw came when I discovered a series of unauthorized withdrawals from one of the family accounts. When I confronted Julia, she feigned ignorance, insisting it must be a banking error. Daniel sided with her, his trust in me wavering for the first time. I felt isolated, gaslit, and powerless in my own home. Yet, beneath the fear and confusion, a spark of resolve began to grow. I realized I couldn't ignore the red flags any longer. Julia's betrayals were no longer subtle. They were a warning, a sign that something far more sinister was at play. And as I lay awake at night, replaying every conversation, every slight, I knew I had to find a way to protect myself and the legacy Richard and I had built before it was too late. But I had no idea just how far Julia was willing to go, or how close I was to losing everything. The invitation to the yacht trip arrived on a crisp Saturday morning. Tucked inside a bouquet of white lilies Julia left on my doorstep. "A family day on the water." The note read, "Just the three of us. Let's make new memories." I hesitated, the words ringing hollow, but Daniel's excitement was infectious. "It'll be good for us, Mom," he insisted, his eyes shining with hope. Against my better judgment, I agreed, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, this was Julia's way of extending an olive branch. The day was picture-perfect clear skies, gentle waves, and the kind of sunlight that makes everything look golden. Julia played the gracious hostess, pouring mimosas and fussing over Daniel, her laughter ringing out across the deck. For a moment, I allowed myself to relax, lulled by the rhythm of the sea and the illusion of harmony. But beneath Julia's polished exterior, I sensed a tension, a coiled energy that made my skin prickle as the afternoon wore on. Daniel disappeared below deck to take a work call, leaving Julia and me alone. The air between us grew thick, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Julia leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "You know, Margaret," she began, her voice low and measured, "I've always admired your strength. But sometimes strength means knowing when to let go." I studied her, searching for the warmth she so often feigned, but found only a steely resolve. "What are you talking about, Julia?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned to face me, her eyes cold and unblinking. "Daniel deserves a future, one without complications." Her meaning was unmistakable. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of fear and disbelief. "You can't possibly," before I could finish. Julia stepped closer, her hand resting on my arm. For a split second, I thought she might plead for understanding, but then her grip tightened, her nails digging into my skin. "It's nothing personal, Margaret. It's just business." With a sudden violent shove, she pushed me over the railing. The world spun as I tumbled through the air, the wind tearing the scream from my throat. I hit the water hard, the shock of the cold stealing my breath. Disoriented, I fought to surface, gasping for air as the yacht drifted farther away. I saw Julia's silhouette above me, her face expressionless, before she turned and disappeared from view. Panic surged through me as I struggled to stay afloat, the weight of my clothes dragging me down. I kicked and thrashed, desperate to keep my head above water, my mind racing with images of Daniel, my son, my only child, completely unaware of the danger he was in. Every muscle burned, but I refused to give in. I thought of Richard, of the legacy we'd built, and the promise I'd made to protect our family. The minutes stretched into an eternity. My arms ached, my lungs screamed for air, and the shore was nowhere in sight. I clung to a stray piece of driftwood, my vision blurring, as exhaustion threatened to pull me under. But somewhere deep inside, a stubborn spark refused to die. I would not let Julia win. I would not let her erase me. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in blood-red streaks, I whispered a silent prayer. I didn't know if anyone would find me, or if I'd survive the night. But I knew one thing for certain. If I made it out alive, I would make Julia pay for what she'd done. And as darkness closed in, I wondered, would this be the end of my story, or just the beginning of a fight I never saw coming? When I finally washed ashore, battered and half-conscious, I was a shell of the woman who'd boarded that yacht. Body ached with every movement, salt stinging the cuts on my arms and legs. I dragged myself onto the sand, coughing up seawater, my mind a blur of fear and disbelief. The world felt surreal, as if I'd slipped into someone else's nightmare. But the pain was real, and so was the cold determination that began to take root inside me. I was alive. That was all that mattered for now. Meanwhile, back on the yacht, Julia was already spinning her web. She called the Coast Guard, her voice trembling with just the right amount of panic. "We can't find Margaret. She must have fallen overboard. I don't know how it happened." Daniel, frantic and guilt-ridden, searched the decks, calling my name into the wind. Julia clung to him, tears streaming down her face, playing the part of the devastated daughter-in-law. I should have watched her more closely, she sobbed, her words laced with just enough self-blame to seem genuine. Daniel, desperate for answers, clung to her every word, never once suspecting the truth. As the hours passed, the search intensified. Helicopters swept the coastline, boats combed the waves, and news of my disappearance spread quickly. Friends and family gathered at our home, offering prayers and support. Julia was at the center of it all, accepting condolences with practiced grace, her eyes never betraying a hint of guilt. She wore my favorite pearl necklace, a subtle reminder to everyone of her place in the family. Daniel, hollow-eyed and exhausted, refused to leave the phone, clinging to hope even as it slipped through his fingers, while Julia played the grieving daughter-in-law. I was fighting for my life in a small rural hospital. A fisherman had found me at dawn, barely conscious, and rushed me to safety. The doctor said I was lucky to be alive, but luck had nothing to do with it. It was rage, heartbreak, and the stubborn refusal to let Julia win that kept me going. My body was bruised and broken, but my mind was sharper than ever. As I lay in that hospital bed, I replayed every moment on the yacht, every word Julia had said, every warning sign I'd ignored. The truth was a bitter pill. It gave me strength. The contrast between Julia's public performance and my private agony couldn't have been starker. She basked in sympathy, her every move calculated to cement her role as the grieving, loyal wife. She even organized a candlelight vigil in my honor, standing at the front of the crowd, tears glistening on her cheeks. Daniel, lost in his own grief, leaned on her more than ever, his trust in her deepening with every passing day. I watched news clips from my hospital room, my anger growing with each image of Julia accepting hugs and condolences meant for me. But I wasn't alone. The nurses who cared for me became my confidants, their kindness a balm for my wounded spirit. One nurse, Maria, listened as I poured out my story, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You have to tell someone," she urged. "Can't let her get away with this." Her words lit a fire in me. I realized that surviving wasn't enough. I needed to fight back, to reclaim my life and expose Julia for who she truly was. As I began my slow recovery, I started to plan. I gathered my strength, piece by piece, determined to return not as a victim, but as a force to be reckoned with. Julia thought she'd won, that she'd erased me from the picture. But she had no idea what I was capable of or how far I was willing to go to protect my family and my legacy. And as I watched her bask in the spotlight, I made a silent vow. The next time we met, the world would see her true face. Asterisk, lying in that hospital bed. I realized I had a choice: remain a victim or become the architect of my own justice. The more I watched Julia's performance on the news, the more resolute I became. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore, I was fighting for Richard's legacy, for Daniel's future, and for every part of me that Julia had tried to erase. The time for silence was over. My first step was to gather evidence. I asked Maria, the nurse who had become my confidant, to help me retrieve my belongings from the yacht. She agreed without hesitation, her loyalty a lifeline in a world that suddenly felt so treacherous. Together, we combed through my things, searching for anything Julia might have missed. In the lining of my purse, I found my phone miraculously undamaged. My heart pounded as I scrolled through my messages and call logs, piecing together a timeline of that day. There were voice memos I'd recorded, snippets of Julia's conversations about the trust and the estate. I'd forgotten I'd even made them, but now they were my secret weapon. Next, I reached out to my lawyer, Mr. Patel, a man Richard had trusted for decades. I told him everything, every suspicion, every detail of Julia's manipulation, and the truth about what happened on the yacht. He listened in stunned silence, then assured me he would help. "We'll need more than your word," he cautioned. "But if you have proof, we can build a case." With his guidance, I began to document everything: the financial discrepancies, the unauthorized withdrawals, the changes Julia had tried to make to the trust. Each piece of evidence was a brick in the wall I was building between Julia and my family's future. Asterisk, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. I called Daniel, my voice trembling as I told him I was alive. His shock quickly turned to relief, but when I hinted at Julia's betrayal, he recoiled. "Mom, that's impossible." "Julia would never." I heard the doubt in his voice, the war between love and loyalty. I didn't push, simply asked him to meet me, to hear me out in person. "There are things you don't know, Daniel. Please, for your father's sake, just listen." Asterisk. As I prepared to return home, I felt a surge of fear and anticipation. The stakes were higher than ever. If Julia realized I was alive and gathering evidence, she might become even more dangerous. But I refused to let fear dictate my next move. I was done being a pawn in her game. Asterisk, the confrontation was coming. I could feel it in my bones the moment when the truth would finally come to light, and Julia would have to answer for everything she'd done. I didn't know how Daniel would react or what would become of our family, but I was ready to face whatever came next. And as I boarded the plane back home, I promised myself this time I would be the one in control. The day Daniel and Julia returned home, the air was thick with anticipation. I waited in the grand foyer, my heart pounding, every sense sharpened by weeks of planning and pain. The house, once a symbol of warmth and unity, now felt like a stage set for a reckoning. When the front door swung open, Daniel froze in the doorway, his eyes wide with disbelief. Julia, a step behind him, went pale as a ghost. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was electric. "Mom," Daniel's voice cracked, hope and confusion warring in his expression. Julia clutched his arm, her grip tightening as if she could anchor herself to him and keep the truth at bay. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Hello, Julia, did you miss me?" My words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I invited them into the living room where Mr. Patel and Maria were waiting. The evidence was laid out on the coffee table: bank statements, voice memos, and a timeline of Julia's actions. Daniel looked from me to Julia, his face ashen. "What is this?" he whispered. Julia tried to regain her composure, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "This is insane. She's trying to turn you against me, Daniel. She's always resented me, but I cut her off." Playing the recording of her voice from that day on the yacht, the words were unmistakable. "It's nothing personal, Margaret. It's just business." Daniel's hands shook as he listened, the reality crashing down on him. Julia's mask slipped, her eyes flashing with anger and desperation. "It can't prove anything," she spat. But the evidence was overwhelming. Mr. Patel calmly explained the legal consequences: attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Julia's bravado crumbled. She broke down, sobbing, begging Daniel to believe her. But the damage was done. The police arrived soon after, and Julia was taken away, her cries echoing through the halls that once rang with laughter. Daniel collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. I sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I should have listened. I should have seen it." I pulled him close, my own tears falling, not just for what we'd lost, but for what we still had. Our family was forever changed, the scars of betrayal etched deep, but we were alive. We had survived. In the days that followed, the house was quieter, the emptiness a constant reminder of all that had happened. Daniel and I began the slow process of rebuilding trust, sharing stories, and finding comfort in each other's company. The legacy Richard left behind was safe, but the cost had been steep. I felt both triumphant and hollow, proud of my strength but mourning the innocence we'd lost. As I walked through the garden one evening, the sun setting just as it had on that fateful day, I realized that closure doesn't always mean happiness. Sometimes it's simply the peace that comes from knowing you did what you had to do. And as I looked back at the house, I knew that, whatever the future held, I would never let anyone steal my story or my strength again. Looking back, I still feel the sting of betrayal, but I also see the woman I became because of it. I learned that trust is precious, and sometimes the people we welcome into our hearts are the very ones who test our boundaries the most. Julia's actions nearly destroyed me, but they also forced me to confront my own fears, to find a strength I never knew I had. I realized that survival isn't just about making it through the storm, it's about standing tall afterward, refusing to let anyone else define your worth or your story. The cost of betrayal is steep. It leaves scars, not just on your heart, but on the way you see the world. I lost the illusion of a perfect family, but I gained something far more valuable: clarity. I learned to trust my instincts, to speak up even when my voice trembled, and to fight for what matters most. Daniel and I are still healing, but our bond is stronger for having been tested. We know now that love isn't blind, it's brave. If you're listening to my story and see pieces of your own life reflected here, know this: you are not alone. You have the right to protect your peace, to demand honesty, and to reclaim your life, no matter how impossible it seems. Betrayal may break you, but it can also build you into someone unbreakable. And as for me, my story isn't over. Life has a way of testing us when we least expect it. But I'm ready for whatever comes next because I know now that I can survive anything. And maybe, just maybe, the next chapter will be one of hope, healing, and new beginnings. Stay tuned.